Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome Senator Menendez, and I want to also just mention that I think your time may be a little crunched because there is a vote shortly on USICA compete. So we're just going to move forward quickly. I'll shorten my introduction and let you speak while we have you. So I'm Orit Frankel, CEO of the American Leadership Initiative. We started in 2018 to develop a 21st century vision and policy agenda for American global leadership based on American interests and shared values. I am honored and delighted to have the opportunity to facilitate today's conversation with Senator Robert Menendez, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. I'm especially looking forward to this conversation as it comes at such a propitious time globally, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, tensions increasing between the US and China, and many post-war institutions crumbling. It feels like an inflection point where the post-World War II order is no longer working, but we have yet to develop a vision for a future world order. The US, meanwhile, is at its own inflection point, with both parties increasingly wary of global engagement. I know of no one better to tackle these questions than Chairman Menendez, who grew up as the son of Cuban immigrants and first entered public service as a 19-year-old college student whose high schools would not provide books to students. During his 30-year tenure, he's been a strong advocate of America's leadership in the world. I'm delighted that he's chosen our platform today to launch his bill, Economic Statecraft for the 21st Century. I'm going to just shorten my introduction, turn it over to you, let you speak, and we'll get through as much as you can. And I understand your two top aides will jump in when you leave, and hopefully we'll get as much of you as you can.
Well, thank you, Dr. Frankel, and I'll let them answer all the hard questions. But seriously, it's a pleasure to be here to discuss with the American Leadership Institute the imperative of reviving and renewing the instruments of American economic statecraft as we deal with the challenges and realities of the 21st century. And to share with you my new legislation introduced today, the Economic Statecraft for the 21st Century Act. In order to understand how we got here, I'd like to begin with a story. Starting just after the end of World War II, before there was an Air Force One, President Truman traveled in a Douglas Skymaster airplane. Officially, it was called the Flying White House at the time. And in July of 1947, Truman sat in the presidential cabin and signed the National Security Act. This act recognized the American government as it turned to the post-war period. And one of the things it did was establish the National Security Council. The statutory members were the president, the vice president, the secretaries of state and defense, as well as two advisors, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the director of the CIA. But it did not include the Treasury Department or other elements of the US government critical to our prosperity here at home or our leadership of the global economy. In the wake of the great geostrategic struggles of the first half of the 20th century, the tools of international finance were not considered central to our national security and foreign policy. We were focused on what we would call hard security. Even though one of the principal triggers of the Berlin blockade, one of the first flashpoints of the Cold War, was the introduction of the new Deutschmark currency in Allied-controlled Germany. And as the Cold War progressed, and even as we experienced how economic models of governance drive domestic and national security policy, our institutions still did not adapt and fully incorporate economic tools into our foreign policy toolkit. Not with the embargo after the Cuban Missile Crisis, not with the freezing of Iranian assets during the hostage crisis, not with the Gulf War when we put sanctions on Iraq. Even as we were reminded time and time again of its importance when faced with the immediate threat of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons, what we now call economic statecraft, the longer-term investments into finance, development, and economic governance remained off to the side. We had multiple reorganizations of our defense and national security agencies over the past 70 years. But it was only a couple of years ago that the Treasury Secretary was finally introduced as a statutory member of the National Security Council. And while we stood up the Development Finance Corporation in 2019, and USAID has long executed economic development programs across various sectors, we still have a lot of catching up to do as a nation. The war in Ukraine reminds us that economic leverage can be just as powerful as an army, both in waging war and in a country's ability to fight back against an aggressor. Geopolitics and geostrategy still matter. History has not ended. In the 21st century, national power increasingly rests on geoeconomic foundations, from fundamental resources like gas and oil to competition in new and emergent technologies like quantum computing, genomics, and artificial intelligence. We can simply look at the consistent priorities of the voters of the United States to know that day-to-day economic issues, like being able to fill your gas tank and your fridge, often drives decisions about other issues. Yet the United States is still operating using the outdated tools of the 20th century. It's time to modernize. So I'm grateful to talk to you today about my economic statecraft bill. It's an important issue that has profound implications for the future of our nation and, for that fact, the world. As we have come to realize, China plays four-dimensional chess around the world. It does so militarily, diplomatically, culturally, and economically. But their ace in the hole, their most effective tool, is their integration of it all under a giant economic toolkit. China has effectively used its economic diplomacy to shape the global political order to align with their values and interests. From originally using the Belt and Road Initiative to export its own domestic overcapacity, to then wielding it to influence votes at the United Nations, one has to acknowledge that China's economic statecraft, while inimical to U.S. interests, has been remarkably effective in advancing their authoritarian view of the world. The Belt and Road has allowed China to use lucrative port contracts to grow its power and win friendly trade terms. These infrastructure projects may be commercially desirable for countries who have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, but can they be relied on at times of national emergency? Letting China build critical infrastructure may be cheap, but there are certainly costs. The increasing prevalence of Chinese companies in international markets is also a growing concern. Seemingly regular transactions can have serious security implications. A deal with a Chinese state-owned enterprise could transform the Chinese military into your partner and your Achilles heel. Globally, China's brand of international economic diplomacy is best described as manipulative investment. It not only threatens global stability, but the free flow of commerce, freedom of navigation, and the resolution of disputes with international law. The U.S. may not be in a position to counter dollar for dollar China's state-owned enterprises or checkbook as it builds infrastructure around the world, but we also don't need to be. That's not where our competitive advantage lies. Our advantage is in our values, in free markets, democracy, and human rights. But to create, shape, and set standards for the 21st century, America and our allies have to show up. If we don't, we risk seeing the rule of law in these countries washed away in a flood of Chinese cash. It is not too late, but time is certainly running out. Revitalizing the rules-based order and institutions built for the 21st century means dealing with the challenges posed by technology, by artificial intelligence. It means being honest about how we advance, these advances, I should say, can also lead to oppression and economic displacement. And it means reforming our institutions in a way that delivers economic prosperity for all of our people. Our best hope at establishing the rules of the road for the future of global commerce is to work together. China has aggressively ingrained itself into the very fabric of nations' successes, and that includes America's supply chain. The United States only recently realized the extent that geoeconomics plays in our national security. It was this belated realization of the power of supply chains and economic diplomacy that caught us flat-footed when COVID began. The industries critical to our survival were not American-made, but Chinese-based. At the start of the pandemic, nurses had to shield themselves with garbage bags. Americans didn't have enough masks because China was hoarding them for their own protection. Even this past January, the KN95 masks distributed to the United States Congress were made in China, a casualty of the inefficient and underachieving bureaucracy steering our geoeconomic policy. It is a bureaucracy divided between the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representatives, and various other agencies, each having their own competing interests, creating a stovepipe system without a coordinated vision. This dynamic makes it difficult to advance our national interests and promote the values of freedom and democracy that flourished in the post-war period. Just this week, we've seen how Russia wields its own form of geoeconomic power. In light of its unprovoked brazen invasion of Ukraine, the free world has rallied together to provide weapons for Kyiv and to cut off Russia's coffers. But because of Europe's reliance on Russia for vital energy resources, some countries are limited in the financial impact they are willing to absorb as their citizens already contend with inflation and high prices on basic commodities. We must support investment into new energy technologies and economic models that will allow for a strategic energy independence for countries currently enmeshed with Russia. It's time to have coordination. We need a new whole of government approach, one rooted in the emerging geopolitical realities of a world more connected, yet more complex than ever. And that's exactly what my economic statecraft for the 21st Century Act will do. This bill tackles these challenges in two parts. The first half of the bill focuses on confronting the anti-competitive and predatory nature of China's international economic policy. And that starts by shining a spotlight on China's economic coercion through transparency. Those applying for U.S. foreign aid will have to disclose everything they owe to Chinese government entities, because U.S. taxpayer dollars shouldn't be used to pay off Chinese loans. It directs the State Department to work with the OECD and come up with a shared set of facts and issue reports on China's Belt and Road initiatives, because predatory subsidies are distorting markets around the world. It creates a presidential task force which will publish a list of cases of Chinese economic coercion, the economic tools China could use in the future, and how the United States can respond to that. And because so much of China's economic coercion is aimed at those countries that increase their ties with Taiwan, we will develop a playbook to help those nations. We also need transparency when it comes to the issue of confronting investment security. My bill will direct the Secretary of State in connection with CFIUS to assist allies and partners in building new disclosure mechanisms so that they will be able to evaluate potential national security risks in their economies. We also need to confront anti-competitive behavior. My bill will direct the state and USTR to identify subsidies by the Chinese government that favor Chinese enterprises. These subsidies warp international markets and can violate American antitrust laws. Custom and Border Protection will report seizures of counterfeit goods and increase inspections from designated countries. And when it comes to intellectual property theft or forcible transfers of American technology, we will publish a list of Chinese state-owned violators. And finally, when it comes to confronting Chinese economic coercion, we will need to deepen our coordination with allies to create resilient supply chains. Whether it's semiconductors, large capacity batteries, critical minerals and materials, or pharmaceuticals, we will keep pushing for transparent, trusted, and sustainable supply chain standards. We will look at China's semiconductor manufacturing capabilities and how they impact the United States. And we will work with allies on export controls of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. These are the ways in which we need to confront China's action. But as I've said from time to time, simply being confrontational with China is not the same as being competitive with China. That's why the second half of the legislation overhauls our economic diplomacy framework so we can effectively compete in the 21st century. First, we have to compete in global infrastructure. China's financing for their Belt and Road Initiative is opaque, but we know that it is far more than the US spent on the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after the war. If we want to compete, we need to support a version of the president's Build Back Better World Initiative. There is an estimated $40 trillion need for infrastructure investments in low and middle income countries. But money's not enough. There also is much more we must do. Promoting the Blue Dot Network's infrastructure quality certification standards, supporting the 3 Cs initiatives to help Central European countries reduce their dependence on Russia, nearshoring supply chains to the Western Hemisphere and bringing domestic production back to the United States. And we need to bolster the Development Finance Corporation's ability to make strategic investments so they can counter China's coercive economic measures in countries like Lithuania. Second, we need to bolster our energy diplomacy. This is crucial not just for confronting China, but also helping countries who are economically dependent on Russia's natural resources. My bill will codify an Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources responsible for protecting energy security and promoting global clean energy production. We will work with our European allies not just to respond to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but also to support countries grappling with the clean energy transition. We will create a clean energy development fund between the Development Finance Corporation and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And we need to reduce the carbon footprint of our international investment portfolio and prioritize projects in countries struggling with transitioning away from carbon use. Because even as we work to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, we have to be more ambitious on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Third, we have to compete in the future of technology. The United States, not China or Russia, should set the standards and global norms in this area. And we need to support the G20's goals in promoting principled and practical standards for international digital connectivity and trade. We will work with our allies on artificial intelligence strategies and policies. My bill mandates that A1 deployment take into account human rights, democratic values, and securities. AI, I should say. And even Vladimir Putin, whose archaic worldview is rooted in the 19th century, has acknowledged that, quote, artificial intelligence is the future for all humankind. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world, he has said. Well, we cannot cede leadership on this to a man who believes he can still redraw the world map by brute force. International cooperation on research and development has great potential. The United States is stronger when we work with allies and partners, and the innovation and creation of the technologies of the next generation is no exception. And fourth, we have to leverage international financial institutions and multilateral pacts. As my bill states, it is the policy of the United States to lead the international economy in the aftermath of COVID-19. This includes developing new ways to ease debt burdens for developing countries. Specifically, my bill will authorize the transfer of special drawing rights to the IMF's new Resilience and Sustainability Trust. This, together with other advanced economies, will pull $100 billion to go to the developing world so that their economies can recover from the pandemic. It also authorizes capital increases at the Inter-American Development Bank and creates a diplomatic strategy for increasing Taiwan's participation there. My bill also directs the U.S. to work with the G20 to have a transparent framework for the debts that developing countries take on, and to increase our engagement at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum to promote our priorities on everything from cross-border investment to emerging markets to improving cybersecurity. And finally, we must compete in strengthening global economic resilience. When the next pandemic hits, the world has to be ready. My bill establishes the Office of Economic Resiliency in the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, which will develop plans with our allies and partners to respond to these types of global destabilizing events. Whether it's COVID-19, public health, or economic recovery, foreign assistance and development institutions are critical in fighting the harmful effects of international shock and stress. So let me close by saying I want to look back about how we got here and what the future holds. 20 years ago, the common consensus was that by joining the international economic order, China would adopt principles of economic liberalization and personal freedom. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Instead, they are using their economic integration to pressure the developing world to choose between our system and values of self-determination, respect for human rights, and openness, or their system and their values of authoritarianism, repression, and censorship. Take, for example, Lithuania. After the opening of a Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius, Beijing reacted by immediately downgrading diplomatic relations with Lithuania. It prevented Lithuanian goods from entering China, effectively creating a trade barrier. That is economic warfare. The good news is that the United States is finally doing something about it. The State Department is creating a playbook to help our allies and partners push back against Chinese economic coercion. The Export-Import Bank replaced the Chinese loan worth $300 million. A trade delegation led by the state and USTDA visited Lithuania to discuss ways to increase cooperation. But there is still more to do because we know this won't be the last time China does this. Lithuania is a test for the West and the international community. If we cannot help them, then we fail the test, and ultimately we will face the consequences. Looking forward, the economic battleground is clear, and the time to act is now. I recently traveled to Japan, Taiwan, and Australia, and it was clear that unless we have an economic and trade agenda, we will not meet the strategic competition challenge with China, and we will not meet the security challenge these countries face. China is our biggest geostrategic threat. Without a robust economic and trade agenda, we cannot win against that threat. This is not just about economic tools that are a critical element of shoring up the free world. This is a confrontation between violent autocrats and those of us fighting for a rules-based international order. This is a battle between dictators who want to act with impunity and those of us standing up for democracy, human rights, and the cause of freedom around the world. And so I'm proud to introduce the Economic Statecraft for the 21st Century Act today. It's time for the United States to reclaim the mantle of global economic leadership. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you today.
So much, Chairman. We are just incredibly fortunate to have you in a leadership position during these tumultuous times. We have quite a list of questions that have come in. So I don't know what your timing is, but I'm just going to start to ask.
When I get the high sign, I'll have to leave. I'll hang in there as long as they keep it open for me on the floor. So
great. Well, a number of questions have come in, and this was actually a question I was prepared to ask as well about the administration's China policy. I mean, as you know, Trump had put in high tariffs. The USTR considered launching a 301 investigation on China's subsidies. They have not to date. So what, and the others in the administration have indicated that the Trump tariff should be lowered to address inflation. But there really has yet to be a comprehensive China policy and strategy announced. What would you like to see the administration do?
Well, I think it's a multifaceted dimension. If China, and I do believe that the answer to the question is yes, is China the single biggest geostrategic challenge we have? Yes, I think there's bipartisan support for that. I think that what we're doing in USICA, as we are trying to move through the Senate floor this week, and into next to get to a final conference is a critical, important element of that. How do we, as I say, not just confront China, but compete with China? And so I think that legislation helps to create a very strong foundation for competing with China. I also think some of the things that I just mentioned in this legislation are all initiatives that the United States has to engage with as it meets the challenge of China. I think that having visited, the Pacific nations that I mentioned, as well as having hosted the ASEAN ambassadors here, that we need an economic/trade agenda to compete with China in the region that also has security dimensions to it. Because, and as I said at the beginning of my comments, we have to show up, because in this region of the world, there is a belief that we are on again, off again lovers. And so, but China's always there at the end of the day. It's there physically, it's there strategically, it's there economically. And so that has to be something I would hope that the Indo-Pacific framework that the administration is pursuing is something that's a welcomed initiative, but I would hope there'd be more meat on the bones. I think we missed the ball on TPP, and we should be thinking about what it is that we can do in closer to that regard. I think that we have to send a very strong message of our solidarity with Taiwan, because if not, other countries in the region will say, if you're not going to support Taiwan, which produces 90% of the high-end semiconductors of the world, which is used in everything that we need in our lives, from the phone that we use, the car that we drive, the refrigerator where we keep our food, and the machines that produce our products. Well, having China have that ability to influence or even control that market is a huge challenge. And then I think we have to stand up to China's predatory trade practices. I think we have to get other countries in a coalition. More and more countries are recognizing the coercive nature of China's economic diplomacy, I'll say, economic efforts. I think that when we join some of the strongest economies in the world, we can counter China. Those are some of the things I'd like to see the administration being engaged in.
That's great. So to your point on IPEF, I think it's great that the administration, as you said, is seeking to engage with those countries. And as you know, they're focusing on raising labor, environmental, and digital standards, which are critical. However, as you know, the administration has said that at this moment, it's not considering offering any market access as part of the equation. Do you think there's an appetite in Congress for offering market access or considering trade promotion authority at this time?
I think there is a growing realization that we cannot speak of China as our single biggest geostrategic challenge and think that not having a trade agenda in that part of the world is going to help us meet that challenge. Now, of course, it is not an oxymoron to say you can have trade and still have protections for workers' rights and environmental questions. Those are obviously part of the mix. But without any market access, then it becomes a far less desirable effort. And it also makes it clearer to the countries in the region that they're going to have to continue to depend upon China in that regard. I think that would be a critical mistake. And then secondly, in the absence of a more global market access trade agenda, we should be looking at where we have bilateral opportunities with countries similarly situated in both our values and our standards, for which we could begin to enter into agreements that would speak to our commitment to the region. I think those are worthy of considering as well.
Thank you. So, as you know, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're facing some existential questions as to whether the post-war architecture is still relevant for today's global realities. Are we moving into a bipolar kind of arrangement? There are increasing calls to decouple more with China. Are we potentially moving into a tripolar world? Where do you see things going in terms of the global stage?
Surely, and that's why I'm fortunate to be my last answer, because I got the high sign that the floor is going to close on me on the vote. So, Dr. Look, what I said as I was visiting throughout the region this past recess is, a lot of countries in the region don't want to be in the position of being told choose between the United States or China. That's not the choice. As I've said to each and every one of the leadership that I met in those countries and those that have come here to visit me in the nation's capital, we do not ask you to choose between China and the United States. As a matter of fact, we invited China into the international order in the expectation that their participation in the international order would not create a Jeffersonian democracy, but would ultimately create a country that is willing to engage and obey by international rules-based systems. Unfortunately, has not. The choice is not between the United States and China. The choice is between what type of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world in which you get to choose those who govern you? Do you want to live in a world in which you get to worship as you please? Do you want to live in a world where your economic future is determined by your intellect or the sweat of your brow? You want to live in a world that you can associate with those who you want to and love those who you want to? Or do you want to live in a world where you have a minder, where you are told what you can and cannot do, how you can or cannot do business, where you are told what you can and cannot worship, and where in the 21st century we have 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, which is unconscionable. That's the choice. And so I think that it is not the question of a bipolar world. It's the question of, should we not be able to amass a global order in which I think most people will choose the first of the two options. Even in those countries where there is more of an authoritarian streak, they don't necessarily want China to be their minder at the end of the day. So I think that there is a greater opportunity to build a foundation upon those core principles. And then the question is, if you want the first world order, then how do we make it happen?
All right. Well, I think that's a great optimistic note on which to end. So thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion. As I said in the beginning, we really are incredibly fortunate to have you steward your leadership stewarding us during these difficult times. I know you have an important vote, and so thank you for taking the time, and we appreciate you needing to go and do the important business that you do every day.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity in the forum, and we look forward to continuing to be engaged with the ALI and all of your member partners.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.